I am honored, I'm really honored that so many of you are still here after a long day of presentations. But having witnessed all of them myself, I would just like to thank the many presenters for really brilliant presentations, a lot of good, serious work behind all of this, and for an extraordinary dose of sobriety, which we don't always get in Washington fora like this. I also wanted to make one special expression of thanks, and that's to a good friend of the Institute, John Malik of California, who has been the very generous sponsor of this conference, and he's made this possible, and I'm extremely grateful to him for having done so. I'd like to talk about U.S. policy options. And the strategic, we have several overall strategic objectives, at least at one level, and that is how to deter war, how to achieve peace, how to preserve some kind of a stable international order, and then, of course, one would hope how to preserve freedom and democracy and the unity of the West. As Professor Wood has said, it's not quite clear that some of these questions underlying the larger political purposes of the United States and the Western alliance are still intact. Although we've heard a lot of it today, just in order that my remarks have some kind of coherence, I would like to make a very brief review of the list of things that the Russians have been doing to challenge the world order in this part of the world. They have, first of all, their national security doctrine, which ever since 1992 has prescribed that they have the right to protect Russian-speaking people wherever they may be if they are mistreated in the sole judgment of the Russians. Another one of their objectives, of course, is to restore the former Soviet political space. They would like to have a sphere of influence in places where they'd like to cast as much of a shadow of their power as possible, and I agree very much with some of the previous analyses of how they would like this sphere of influence to prevail in East Central Europe, and frankly over Europe as a whole. The Russians have the task of trying to prevent and to stop American primacy in the world and in Europe. They have the objective of trying to split up NATO. They would like to establish their own Eurasian axis, and perhaps they may have some other larger objectives than this, but at least those are the ones that are palpably evident. What have they done? They have been doing massive intelligence penetrations of every country in their larger attempted sphere of influence. They had been doing this partly because they were controlling the sister intelligence services of East Central European countries, and they had extremely deep penetrations, as you know, in East Germany and in West Germany as well, less so in other European countries, but nevertheless they have dossiers on tens of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of people. Remember, 25% of the East German population were informants for the Stasi, and so there are all sorts of people who have been compromised in one way or another and who can be blackmailed. In any event, these intelligence penetrations have been and can continue to be used in numerous fashions. The Russians, I don't know this, because the U.S. intelligence community assiduously refrained from examining this question, but we learned from the highest, what arguably the highest ranking defector out of the Soviet bloc in terms of the strategic importance of his position, General Jan Šejna of Czechoslovakia, who was head of the Czechoslovak Defense Council, that the Soviets were involved in international narcotics trafficking, all the way going back to the 1950s, where Nikita Khrushchev, who was extremely impressed with the activities that the Chinese were doing in the narcotics field as a weapon of war during the Korean War, and he wanted to replicate the effectiveness of those types of operations for the Soviet Union. So he set up a plan called Druzhba Narodov, Friendship of the Peoples, where he got the satellite states and from Eastern Europe, North Vietnam, Cuba, etc., to be involved in pushing international narcotics in the West. And it was not only to pickle the minds of the next generation and to earn money. As a matter of fact, Šejna testified that the monies earned by the Czechoslovak intelligence service alone were enough to pay for its entire budget, and this was the monies earned from illegal narcotics trade. But a large part of the narcotics trade was also involved in penetrating many narcotics markets, for example, those in Latin America, in order to get dossiers on corrupt officials who were involved in this business so that they could be manipulated for intelligence and political influence purposes. I assume that this is still going on to the extent that the Russians can do it, especially since we know that KGB and GRU intelligence operations were not diminished at all in the United States after the end of the Cold War. The Russians have been buying local companies in East Central Europe, and many of them have been controlled by the FSB or the SVR. Many of them are controlled by Russian oligarchic / mafia-controlled Russian corporations, and the more these Russian corporations control successful East Central European corporations, the less sovereignty these countries enjoy. Of course, we know that the Russians have been engaged in energy blackmail. They have been supporting leaders and factions covertly within many of these different countries. They have been sending in their agents provocateurs. We know about what they've been doing in Ukraine, which has proven now to be obvious, but they've been doing it in the Baltic states. They do it in other countries in East Central Europe. They have been bribing various parliamentarians. One of our professors at IWP, who is one of the foremost authorities on the non-Russian nationalities of the former USSR, who couldn't be here today, unfortunately, Paul Goebel, has testified that the Russian FSB is bribing 25% of the members of the Estonian parliament. And here you have Estonia, which is one of those countries that is as pro-American, pro-Western as any in Europe, and yet its political elites are potentially and actually severely compromised. You have the tradition of divide and conquer tactics, and this has been going on as part of Soviet nationalities policy for years. Separate the Armenians from the Azeris and set them at each other's throats. The Uzbeks from the Meshet Turks, the Gagauz versus the Moldovans, the Lithuanians versus the Poles, etc., etc., etc. The Abkhazians and the Ossetians against the Georgians. There are many other types of this interethnic conflict. It's going on within individual groups within Ukraine today, and it is undermining the solidarity that ought to exist and that we hope can continue to exist in these formerly communist lands. Let's not forget about huge Russian propaganda. We have reviewed a little bit what RT has been doing. The massive propaganda and active measures, disinformation. Remember the nuclear threats, their nuclear buildup, their military cooperation with China, their now readiness to send advanced air defense systems to Iran. Remember the Russian interceptions of aircraft, of military aircraft, some very dangerous and unprofessional activities, whether it's dealing with the Danes or with American aircraft or coming off our own coast. The submarine provocations in the Baltic Sea near Sweden and elsewhere. You have the invasion of Georgia. You have the cyber attack on Estonia. Of course, the invasion of Ukraine. You have Putin's questioning of the historical validity of Kazakhstan. And you have such things as the covert support. It was mentioned briefly. I don't know how many of you caught it, but the covert Russian support for the environmental movement in Western Europe, particularly in Germany, to prevent the Germans and other countries in Europe from developing an indigenous natural gas capability. What has the U.S. response been? It has been essentially one reflective of no strategy. The U.S. response basically reveals an overall, what I believe is an overall crisis in U.S. national security policy. And it's hard sometimes to get people to believe this, to use the apparently hyperbolic word of crisis, especially when it is you have an apparent policy of drift, of inertia, of actions that are just a little too late, even though they are on the sort of positive side of the ledger. But all of this amounts to a crisis when you see what the net results are. What we have here is a failure to deter, a failure to keep the West united, a failure to preserve the international system, and of course it is a reflection of the fact that there is no strategy. But you can't have, one of the most elementary principles of strategy is that you can't have a strategy unless you have goals. And there are no coherent goals out of the US government. And you can't have goals unless you have some kind of national consensus on our values and principles which underlie our civilization. And this is why I think that what Professor Wood was saying a little earlier are amongst the most profound insights that lie at the heart of everything that we're talking about here. This is a fundamental problem of our worldview, our purpose as a nation, and whether Western civilization is something that deserves to be to be defended in light of the cultural state of affairs that has been happening in this country. I may reflect on this a little bit more in a moment. U.S. policy in the face of most of these Russian actions has been silence, has been willful blindness, has been appeasement, and has been a de facto continued retrenchment from the world based on the assumption that American power in the world is something ultimately that is toxic and that has produced bad results wherever it has been seriously exercised. Now, I happen to be one of those people who think that our intervention, our occupation, and our nation-building effort in Iraq was a strategic disaster for the United States. And I think it was a squandering of resources. I think it was done on the basis of certain kinds of utopian views that you could go in there with the U.S. Armed Forces and try to remake and make a democracy out of another country as if culture doesn't exist, as if the habits and the traditions and the mentality built up over decades, if not centuries, don't exist. But this is not. I think that the intentions behind those who tried to intervene in Iraq were basically noble ones. I think they were imprudent ones. But it is unfortunate that I think this exercise, and when you look at the two combined wars and their full cost, they come, that the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, which also is attempting another utopian task of creating a central government in a country which has never had one, which is a confederation of tribes, and where transferring the loyalty from tribe to the larger federal government, so to speak, to the larger state, is another quixotic and utopian enterprise. But the cost of these two wars has been and will be altogether some $6 to $8 trillion. But the larger cost of these adventures has been the shaking of our faith in the worthiness of our country, of our democracy, of our Western civilization. And this is going to be a huge task to try to overcome, and it will require truly stout national leadership to try to do this. What has been our reaction to the Georgian invasion, the reset policy? Our reaction to the Smolensk air crash. And by the way, I don't know the latest of all the documents, and some of these have been, of course, distributed to those of you who are interested, but there is serious evidence that there were 2 explosions on that plane. 2 explosions, which is why many of the bodies on that plane were blown into little bits. And normally when a plane like that crashes, going at normal landing speed, the bodies are intact. They may be bruised and bumped around and broken bones, but they're intact. They're not in little pieces. Somebody put some bombs on that plane, and it is a serious question that ought to be investigated by a serious international panel of experts. And of course the Russians have covered all of this up and lied about it and adulterated the crash site and so on. Please don't let me get going on this. Another reaction to the Georgian invasion was the New START agreement, a worthless arms control agreement when it comes to U.S. national security interests, and it was signed by the worthies in this administration despite their knowledge of ongoing Soviet violations of the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty and the Intermediate Range, the INF Treaty, the Treaty on Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces, both of which have been violated by the Russians. And let's just remember, the Chekists who are in charge of Moscow today have the same statecraft as the Soviet Union, and part of that statecraft is using arms control not as a means of controlling arms, but as a means of political warfare and strategic deception and counterintelligence operations, gaining counterintelligence advantage. The Russians have a strategy to violate agreements. They develop this strategy before they sign agreements, and the people in our arms control industry are willfully blind towards this reality of Russian statecraft. What was the U.S. Another thing in the wake of the Russian invasion of Georgia. We abandoned the deployment of the advanced ABM systems in Poland and the Czech Republic. Then they invade Ukraine. What is our reaction there? Some selective sanctions, good, a little bit, not particularly crippling. There are some things that we could do. We could do things as severe as preventing the Russians from participating in the SWIFT banking transaction system. We decided that we would set up a 4,000 troop rapid reaction force. I think that this is a joke, and if I think it's a joke, then I think that Putin thinks it's twice as much of a joke as I do. All they have to do is to continue laying the subversive groundwork in the Baltic states, just the way they've done in Ukraine. Then they could insert their separatists into so-called separatists into Latvia, and they could do all of this on a Friday afternoon. Well, maybe by Sunday we might get people roused away from their weekend golf games, and they could assemble and decide to have an assembly of people in the North Atlantic Council. Well, the North Atlantic Council might meet late on Monday afternoon, have some deliberations on Tuesday, and by Wednesday make a decision to send the 4,000 troop rapid reaction force. But of course it'll be too late to send it because all of Latvia will be occupied by then. And then the Washington Post and some of the other places, well, the Post has actually gotten a lot better. They've got some really pretty decent editorialists right now on these matters of East Central Europe. But let's say the New York Times will say, why die for Danzig? Why die for Danzig indeed? So then we have part of our reaction to the invasion of Ukraine has been the utter disregard of U.S. obligations under the Budapest 1994 Memorandum on Security Assurances. This is the thing you will recall. Everyone has forgotten it. The media won't remind you. The administration swept it, didn't just sweep it under the rug. They kept it under there for 5 minutes, and then they took a special vacuum cleaner that is attached to their sewer system, and all of the information about the Budapest Memorandum has been flushed down the tubes. And this is, and of course, this was the memorandum that guarantees continued Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity and so on and so forth, so long as they would give up their nuclear weapons. Well, we've just sent a magnificent message to the whole world, that a message that will do nothing but increase nuclear proliferation and dissuade anybody from ever again giving up their nuclear weapons when this is what happens to you when you give up your nuclear weapons. I'm actually rather pleased. I was in Poland a couple of years ago and gave a little lecture and suggested that the Poles ought to develop a Japan-style capability of nuclear energy, which could perhaps have a breakout capability that might rival what the Iranians are doing today. If everybody from the North Koreans and the Israelis and the Iranians and everybody else can have nuclear weapons, why can't the Poles have them too? Well, the Russians see all of this as a sign of weakness. The Russians make all of their strategic moves on the basis of an assessment of the correlation of forces. What are the relative strengths and weaknesses of their adversaries in relation to themselves? And when they see strength, they either stay put or they retreat. If they see weakness, they advance. This is all, and then the advance, it all depends upon the relative strengths and weaknesses again. 2 steps forward, and if necessary, 1 step back, maybe even 2 steps back again. But they always want to make sure that when that 1 step back occurs, that their adversaries confuse that tactical step back for a change in strategy, when in fact it's nothing of the kind. What should we do? Well, first we have to recognize what has proven successful in the past. I'm very happy that NSDD 75, signed by President Reagan, was mentioned here by Professor Gorka. This was the strategic plan that helped bring down the Soviet Empire. And it was a multifaceted plan that used all of the different arts of statecraft. It involved the military buildup, it involved economic measures to try to deprive them of hard currency, to lower the oil prices, for example, to deprive them of advanced technology. There were parts of that which were not particular, there were parts of the spirit of that plan which were not revealed until later, such as permitting the KGB to steal certain technologies from us that they were desiring intensely, but we made sure that some of those technologies didn't work very well. And may have had software bombs in them, or bad blueprints, or whatever it is that would get them going down a warren of rabbit holes from which it would be difficult to extricate themselves. We need to, we have experience in doing this kind of stuff. And I think people in deterring and stopping imperialist aggression and expansionism. We have to tap into that knowledge. We have to also remind ourselves about what are our vital interests in this region and acknowledge very specifically the success of NATO expansion. NATO expansion is one of the best investments that has ever been made in modern times for the security of the United States, the security of the West, and for world order. Why? You heard Professor Chodakiewicz's brilliant review of the history of all of these incredible conflicts within the intermarium region, where everybody is against everybody else. And you have, incredibly stupid conflicts like the Czech and versus the Polish conflict over Chechen, or sometimes known as Teschen. What the hell? This is just unbelievable foolishness. And it's not the kind of thing that can continue. We have to remember that the Russians are trying to stimulate this kind of stuff, and we cannot let our friends in Eastern and Central Europe be goaded into interethnic conflicts over these ridiculous kinds of issues. The NATO expansion gave the prospective new members an incentive to behave themselves, to stop doing this kind of nonsense. Gave them an incentive and said, if you want to be part of the Western security arrangements, stop the irredentism. Stop the stupid little desire for extra territory here or reclaiming the territories where one once enjoyed former glory. Stop it and join the Western community of civilized nations. Behave yourself and worry about letting your people rise to the highest level of their God-given abilities and create wealth and enjoy peace. And it worked. It worked, despite the fact that most of these economies were not decommunized, and there was insufficient lustration. And I have to acknowledge again the extraordinary efforts of Minister Macierewicz, who tried the most serious effort at lustration. This is the jargon term that refers to the exposure of the KGB connections of people within Poland in this particular case, so that, no, they weren't going to be jailed or hanged. They were simply not going to be given the privilege of serving in high positions of public responsibility. Unfortunately, there were too many post-communists in the government, in the parliament, and they voted against Minister Macierewicz's government headed by Prime Minister Olszewski, and the government was voted out, and the post-communists were ready to continue there. I have a friend who says, well, you know, let's not lament this too much. It's better that a former Chekist should, and communist should steal a hotel and start offering hotel services rather than hitting you over the head with a truncheon. And I suppose that is a little bit better, but unfortunately many of these people are compromised. They continue to work with the Russians to the detriment of the security of their own country and the West in general. We have to recognize that what one of our main jobs has to be here is to pressure the Russians to channel their energies into constructive internal policies, and even to try to get them to realize that it is in their long-term interest to work with the West on some of the genuine threats to civilization, and those are coming from the radical Islamists, and I would also mention from the Chinese. The Chinese, I'm more concerned, frankly, about the Chinese than I am about any security threat to the United States, frankly. I think the Chinese have an incredible strategy going to supplant the United States as the world's premier power. They have a global strategy that's being realized in so many different respects. They and the Russians are stealing our intellectual property through cyber espionage at a rate of breathtaking proportions. It's the greatest theft of intellectual property in the history of the world. It's happening as we sit here. We should be collaborating with the Russians against this. And by the way, the day will come when the Chinese are going to have more of their nationals in Siberia than the Russians are, and I can almost hardly wait to see the day when they will call for a referendum in Siberian territory. So, what do we have to do concretely? We need to send signals of strength to retain our credibility. We need to have credible deterrence. Deterrence works. It's a lot better than war. We need to reverse the debilitating cuts in our national defenses. Our Army is going back to pre-World War II days in terms of its size. Our Navy is going back to pre-World War I days in terms of its size. Our lack of readiness is growing every day. It is catastrophic what is going on with our armed forces today. We need to shore up our allies in Central and Eastern Europe, particularly the Baltic states, the frontline states, the Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Hungary. We need to supply all of these countries with more advanced weapons, especially missile defenses. I'm glad to see that we're going to be giving some Patriot missiles to the Poles. We need to deploy permanent bases there in these countries with large numbers, meaningful numbers of American troops that are similar to the troop presence that we have in South Korea. This is not going to match exactly man for man what the Russians have, but it will be a serious tripwire, It won't be the ridiculous scenario of the 4,000 people who won't be sent to try to eject the Russians from Latvia. We need to deploy that most advanced ABM system back in Poland and the Czech Republic. We need to arrange for Ukraine to receive adequate defensive arms so that they cannot persist in what the Russians cannot persist in what they're doing without paying a high price. We need to keep sending food to the Ukrainian military and other such things. We have to ensure, I'm not an expert on sanctions, but we need to pay some very serious attention to the sanctions that are in place. We also have to try to do what we can to mitigate the degree to which those members of the NATO alliance who are being hurt by the sanctions and by counter-sanctions will not be so hurt. If the French have built some ships for the Russian Navy, let's buy those ships for our Navy, and then the French won't be in pain, and our Navy will be, or let some other NATO country buy them. Why should they have to go to the Russians? Of course, we need to trump Russian energy blackmail. A lot has been said about this, the development of energy independence in this country, exporting LNG, exporting oil, all of the other things. We've heard a lot about it. I just wanted to touch it. One of the things that I believe is really important we should also do is develop this remarkable new nuclear reactor that's been developed by General Atomics. This is a small, portable nuclear reactor. It can be put on the back of a flatbed truck. It will not melt down. It is less vulnerable than any other kind of nuclear reactor to abuse for weapons proliferation purposes. It is not water-cooled, it is helium-cooled. This little thing on the back of a flatbed truck will supply electricity to a town of 333,000 people. But General Atomics isn't developing it because right now the price per kilowatt hour for nuclear power is prohibitively high. But this is a national defense expenditure. This is a national defense expenditure. This should not be governed, the development of this reactor should not be governed by the marketplace. We could send these things to Ukraine. We could send them to Poland. We could send them all over the place. If there's a problem with one of them, they could be buried or they could be helicoptered out of there. And these are much safer, much safer and much less dangerous than some of these antiquated nuclear plants that are all over Europe, even in this country, not to mention the Japanese ones. One of the things that we have to pay very serious attention to is countering Russian propaganda and active measures. They have this massive information campaign. They've been brainwashing people on both sides of the border in Ukraine, Russian-speaking people both in Russia and in Ukraine. There are no contrary voices. We shut down the Russian service of the Voice of America. We shut down the Ukrainian service. Radio Liberty has neither of these services. The last thing was I think U.S.-Russian broadcasting that was coming out of a local AM station based affiliate in Moscow, and Putin shut that one down. Well, you know, you can jam just about everything, but you can't jam all shortwave broadcasts. But today, the U.S. government is trying to shut down all shortwave broadcasts. I've been on top of this issue for the last 30 years, and right now they've been, for the last 3 years, the government's been trying to shut down all shortwave broadcasts to China, when shortwave radio is Beijing's #1 method of communication with its own people. And our Voice of America broadcasts and our Radio Free Asia broadcasts that get in there are the only unfiltered information that gets to 1 billion Chinese people. We wanted to shut those Chinese broadcasts down to save $8 million. That's with an M, ladies and gentlemen. And as I like to say, some of you have heard me say it, $8 million is the amount of money that fell out of a hole in the pocket of a sergeant in the Anbar province in 2007. We have no serious strategic communications capability in this government. None. We shut down the United States Information Agency in 1999. This has to be revived. We have to have the capacity to communicate messages to the world. We need to tell the truth to the world. The world needs alternative ideas. Right now, we broadcast over the Voice of America to Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world. We get most of those broadcasts in there through 400 affiliated radio stations in Indonesia. This administration is about to shut down that service, and that's the only alternative messaging that we're getting into Indonesia to try to counter the jihadist radicalization messages that are getting through on multimedia. It's frankly unbelievable what's going on with the unilateral disarmament of our capacity to persuade the world of anything. One of our professors has long said that the United States national foreign policy community would rather kill somebody than persuade him. We need to be exposing Russian criminality. We need to be exposing Russian aggression. We need to be exposing such things as their assassination of their internal political enemies. We need to be exposing their violations of their international obligations. We need to analyze, we need to collect intelligence on their disinformation and strategic deception programs. We need to analyze them, declassify some of it, and expose it to the world. In Western countries, the founding fathers of this country warned that the Republican form of government is uniquely vulnerable to the insidious wiles of foreign influence. Those are the words of George Washington. Foreign influence operations. The KGB, the Chinese, the Muslim Brotherhood are all active doing these things. This is fundamentally a counterintelligence function. We have virtually no national strategic attention devoted to this problem, and I'd venture to say that the countries of our allies in NATO, have virtually no defense against these things. The main defense against these influence operations is to collect intelligence on them and expose them publicly. Then they lose their sting. We could do some things to go on a counteroffensive if we had a covert action capability. We don't. We could be mobilizing dissent within the Russian Empire. We could be helping to mobilize various different national groups that are sick and tired of living under Russian rule. We could be delegitimizing the Russian control over Kaliningrad. Why on earth are we even calling it Kaliningrad? Why don't we call it Krulevets? Or Königsberg would be better. The Russians have absolutely no basis upon which to be possessing this land. No basis whatsoever, no history, and yet they have it, and it's bristling with their weapons. Just a couple of last points. We need to be combating their divide and conquer tactics by trying to expose them and by encouraging more and more solidarity among the different nations and individual ethnic groups within the East Central European region. We need to be encouraging cultural nationalism rather than ethnic nationalism. And that cultural nationalism is something that ultimately has to be based on the common values and principles of Western civilization. One thing that I might also mention is there are some parts of the NATO alliance that don't particularly care about the Russian problem today, because they're suffering from another security threat. Look at what the Italians are suffering with these mass migrations and with the threat of a possible terrorist attack on St. Peter's. I think that we should be doing something to help the Italians and let the Italians know that Europe is a whole. And so we're going to work to try to help the Italians with this major, both humanitarian and terrorist, the humanitarian problem and the terrorist threat that are interrelated, by the way. And maybe we could try to get their cooperation in helping with the Russian matters. We need altogether to restore a national security strategy. But this is ultimately a question. But you know, no strategy without goals, no goals without values. And we need to have national leadership that restores the West's faith in those ideas that produce representative government, the rule of law, the dignity of the individual human person, the human rights that derive from that dignity. Everything that the West is all about. Our intelligentsia have proven to be treasonous about all of this. La trahison des clercs, the treason of the clerks, the treason of the intellectuals. Our intelligentsia would not sign the Declaration of Independence. They don't believe in its first paragraph. They don't believe that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. What do they believe? They believe that our rights are endowed by the state. They believe that our rights come from men and not from some higher authority. They believe all moral standards come from personal preferences rather than recognizing they come from a transcendent source, be it God or nature. And when you reject the existence of the transcendent objective moral order, where do moral standards come from? Where do rights come from? They come from personal preferences, and personal preferences writ large on the social plane mean power struggle. Might makes right. And those states that run according to the doctrine of might makes right are fascist, Nazi, communist, radical jihadist. And that's where, by the way, I take exception with one thing that you said. There is something that links the fascists, the communists, the Nazis, and the radical jihadists. The radical jihadists have taken the place of God themselves. They don't believe in God. They are God. They establish their own standards of what is right and wrong the way God, one assumes, does. And they, therefore, can say that the ends justify the means. These are totalitarians, and the question is, are our elites going to continue to sit in the same sandbox with the totalitarians, or will they go back to the principles of the Founding Fathers, which have produced the liberty and the prosperity that we enjoy in Western civilization? Thank you.
Well, what does one do after a summation like that? I think it would be foolhardy of me to try and add to it. Truly a remarkable tour d'horizon, and I completely concur. By the way, I've said myself that the jihadist movement we face today is a hybrid form of totalitarianism. Let's remember Arthur Koestler famously called communism a godless religion. Well, this is another form of religious totalitarianism, but where they impute to themselves a godlike power. The caliphate is exactly of this ilk. But I will not even attempt, I will not dare to add to the list of concrete recommendations that President Lenczowski has given us. Let me just finish today by giving you my perspective from my field, which is the theory of war and the theory of strategy. And just very, very briefly, how it applies to the current crisis in Central and Eastern Europe. I would just like to sum up the so what of today in three very, very brief points. Number one, Russia is not our partner. Number two, Russia has a plan. And number three, we are the enemy. That must shape any response we have to the current crisis. Allow me to return to the greats, to Sun Tzu and to Clausewitz. Clausewitz has shaped Western understanding of warfare since the Napoleonic era. And his understanding has suffused everything we think about wars in the modern age. And his most famous contribution is, of course, the Clausewitzian dictum, that war is the admixture of politics by other means. It is the continuation of politics by other means. Let me put it to you that Clausewitz was correct in the age of Napoleon, in the age of levée en masse, of large regularized units meeting each other on the battlefield in open conflict. But the concept of war being the continuation of politics by other means must be put on its head at the beginning of the 21st century. What Colonel Putin has proven to us is that politics is war. That the unconventional, that the non-kinetic is how you prepare the battlefield. And if you do it effectively, you don't even have to deploy your main battle tanks. For as Sun Tzu said, the ultimate form of victory is to win without fighting. Vladimir Putin, for all the reasons Professor Lenczowski has enumerated, is winning his war against NATO and America without fighting us. He may be killing Ukrainians, but he's not killing Americans or Germans or Brits. Yet in our actions, we have capitulated. Let me add a data point just to reiterate the reality in which we live and to explain why, for example, Ed Luttwak, who some of you may have heard of, who along with Martin van Creveld is one of the two most famous anti-Clausewitzian authors out there, Ed Luttwak's recent book on the Byzantium Empire, which explains how an empire that should have collapsed the day after it was declared lasted for more than 7 centuries. Why that book is one of the most popular texts in Moscow and why he is feted by the Kremlin. There is a fabulous database, an unclassified university database called the Correlates of War Project, currently at Penn State. And this database has collected all the metadata from every war since 1815. So from the Napoleonic era onwards, it has collected all the pertinent data of every war. When the war started, who was involved, how it ended, how many killed, how many wounded. In an article I wrote 4 years ago with David Kilcullen, which was a critique of America's counterinsurgency policy in Iraq and Afghanistan, we opened our analysis with just one fascinating data point. If you take all of the wars since Napoleon as your data set, and there are 460 of them, something remarkable happens when you divide them into two categories. Conventional interstate war, war between regularized forces of government, nation-state controlled forces, versus irregular warfare or unconventional warfare. When you are fighting tribes, when you are fighting terrorists, the Barbary pirates, or little green men. Of the 460 wars since Napoleon, less than 20% were conventional warfare. 380 wars since Napoleon have been about things like little green men, or jihadists, or unconventional forces, or insurgents. So we can rest assured that this kind of conflict is in fact the reality of war. Divisions of tanks arrayed against each other, such as in World War II or the First Gulf War, are in fact the anomaly, are the oddity in war. And we can expect that not only Colonel Putin, but the regime in North Korea, the Chinese, the Iranians today on the battlefields of Syria and Iraq are much better versed and understand that this type of war, irregular war, is in fact the history of war. We need as a nation to understand that war is occurring now against American interests. Today, as we speak right here. Not just on the fields of Ukraine, not just on the cityscapes of Syria or Iraq, but in the cyber domain, in the political domain, in the propaganda domain, in the economic domain, today as we speak. As I was preparing my thoughts to conclude today, it stunned me that very soon we will be celebrating or commemorating the 100th anniversary of a certain revolution. 2 years from now will be the centenary of the Red October Revolution. Today, Moscow is preparing and executing a new revolution, and it isn't even on its own territory. What will be America's response? At the moment, all we can say is it will be inadequate, and perhaps we don't even realize we are at war. On that note, which brings us to the mission of the Institute, I would like to thank the sponsors, especially all our participants, and it is truly a mark in Washington when the room is as full at the end of the day as it was in the beginning, and I think is a credit to your understanding the stakes involved. And I'd like to thank the staff and especially our speakers. Thank you very, very much, and thank you, Dr. Lenczowski.